Now it's time to grind the blade. Everything up to this point could have been done by a trained monkey. A patient trained monkey anyway. But what we're going to do next actually takes some skill. Now, let me point out that you can make jigs that will help you grind perfect bevels on your blade. But since I'm a masochist, I like to grind freehand. And frankly, if you're just starting out, I think learning to freehand grind helps you become a better knife maker. Before I start grinding though, I want to set myself up for success. As we've mentioned before, symmetry is important in handcrafted knives. So, I'll use this scribe to mark roughly where I want each blade bevel to terminate. By following these lines, I'll end up with symmetry in the blade grind. This isn't just a cosmetic issue. The more symmetrical the knife, the less likely it is to warp during heat treatment. Additionally, I'll paint the blade with machinist's layout fluid and then use my calipers to scribe a target grind line. I don't need to hit this exactly, but it gives me a rough target. Anyway, here goes. First I'll establish the beginning of the bevel. Then I'll tighten up my angle a little bit and start grinding the bevel closer to its ultimate grinding angle. Here are the important things to look out for when you're freehand grinding. First, you want to keep the blade angle steady. Hold it firmly in your hands, tighten up your arms to your sides, and let your whole body move from side to side. Don't stab at it or fiddle with it or change your mind in the middle of a grind. Once you get it in there, it's steady as she goes. Start at the plunge line, that's the little line here that defines the edge of the ricasso, and move steadily across the blade without pausing. If you don't use a consistent motion and pressure, you'll end up with an uneven grind line, and possibly with little waves and dips in the blade. Next point, and this is where practice makes perfect, you want to feather the blade super gently onto the platen until you feel that the blade is flat on the platen. You will not get this the first time, trust me. Nobody throws a perfect curveball or swishes a free throw the first time they try it. Practice makes perfect. If you just went out and bought your first piece of 440C and this is the first knife you ever do, I'd really recommend practicing on mild steel and, make a bunch of blades and just throw the results in a heap. That'll give you a lot more skill and confidence once you start taking on this more expensive piece of steel. I try to put the blade edge itself on the belt, just barely kissing it, and then ease it in quickly until I feel the flat hit the belt. Very gently, but also as quickly as possible. Once you have total contact with the belt across the whole bevel, then you put more pressure on the blade and begin grinding from side to side. You can either apply more pressure at the top or at the bottom using your wrists and thumbs. This will either advance the grind in toward the edge or let you climb up the blade toward the spine. Just keep working it, taking your time, looking at the blade, seeing where you want to end up and adjusting as you go. In my case, I'm aiming to make a very high, steep grind. This takes a lot more skill than a short, sharp grind. If this is your first time out, I really wouldn't advise you to try and grind quite as high as I do here. But my theory is that a knife is supposed to cut, and the higher the grind, the better the knife will cut, so that's what I'm doing here. Now, it's rare that everything will be perfect, so you just keep adjusting and adjusting as you go. Once I'm pretty close to those guidelines I was aiming for, I'll switch to my 120 grit aluminum oxide. Once I get to 120, I want to make sure my grind lines are nice and clean and symmetrical. After that, I'll finish up with 220 grit. Now it's time for heat treating. Heat treating, for those of you who are just learning about knife making, is the process of heating and cooling steel in order to optimize its hardness. 440C is hardened by bringing the steel up to about 1900 degrees, soaking it for 45 minutes or so, and then air or oil quenching it. It's very temperature sensitive and you need specialized equipment. Or not. Because here's the great thing about stainless steel as a steel for beginners. You can ship it out to somebody else to do the heat treating, so you don't have to devote a big chunk of your shop to heat treating equipment. Over the long haul, if you really want to get into knife making, you're probably going to want to develop your own skills in heat treating. But when you get started, one of the great things about stainless steel is you can buy a piece of stainless steel, you can shape your knife, and then send it off to a professional heat treater who can assure you that the knife that you're going to have is going to be hard, durable, and so forth, that it's going to have all the working qualities that you're looking for. With 440C, you want to aim for about 58 on the Rockwell C scale. Tell that to your heat treater, send off your knife, and a couple weeks later it'll come back to you in the mail, hardened and tempered, ready to rock. I heat treat my own knives, but there's no reason you have to. Okay, so let's assume your knife just came back in the mail. It'll now be hardened and tempered, meaning that it will be far harder than it was when you sent it in. It will also be covered with a small amount of scale. You'll need to use sandpaper to remove it. Again, only a small part of the blade needs to be cleaned up with any care, that little crescent encompassing the ricasso and the top of the grind line. You'll also want to use a heavy grit on the handle portion just so that the epoxy will adhere well to the metal, and then use 320, 600, maybe even 1200 or 1500 to pretty up the portion of the blade that will be visible. Now I'll go back to the grinder and clean up the grind. I'm not doing anything aggressive here at all, just cleaning up the oxides and the earlier scratches. If I wanted to make a satin finish or a mirror polish, I'd run up through some fairly high grit numbers. But in this case, I'm not making a super fancy knife, and the grind marks will be part of the aesthetic or the design of the blade. So I'll just take it up to 220 grit aluminum oxide using a nice fresh belt, that's key, and that'll give me a nice, clear, crisp set of grind marks. One thing to be aware of: when grinding before heat treating, you can grind like crazy, heat it till it glows, whatever, and you're not ruining the steel. But if you overheat the steel now, and you'll know because it'll suddenly turn blue where it overheats, then you've just ruined the hardness of the steel in that spot. So as you're grinding, keep dipping it in the water bucket and be especially careful near the edge. Once I'm happy with the grinds, a nice clean plunge line and an even grind across the spine, symmetry's good, all that, then I'm just going to quit. Next step, it's time to finish up the handle. I'll start by cutting 4 1/8 inch pins for the bolsters from a piece of 3/16 stainless steel round stock. I want it to be the same as the bolsters so that the color matches and they just all blend together. The classic method of securing bolsters is to use solder. This makes for an extremely durable bolster, but it also leaves a little tiny line of solder between the bolster and the blade. This seems to have gone out of fashion, and a lot of makers just use epoxy now. That's what I'll be doing. I won't just be trusting the epoxy though. I'll also peen the end of the pins, meaning that I'll flare them with a hammer. This will make it so that not only do I have a glue bond, but I'll also have a mechanical bond that will literally lock the blade to the bolster. I'm just using store-bought 2-part epoxy. There are fancier epoxies that might be better, but good old Loctite has held up pretty well for me in the past. You'll need to rough up the surface of the bolsters and degrease everything with extreme care though. If you don't, the bond won't last for squat and your scales will eventually peel off. Okay, since this is 5-minute epoxy, time's at a premium. I'd prefer to use 1-hour epoxy, but this is just what I happen to have in the drawer today. Slower curing epoxy is a little bit stronger, but still, this is pretty strong stuff. So, I set everything out on my anvil in order, carefully planning the order of assembly. If I screw it up, or if I have to make decisions in the middle of the assembly, I'm likely to end up with the glue setting on me before I've got everything secure. Even if you're not using a quick set epoxy, you're still better off thinking everything through when you're gluing. Here goes. First, I mix the epoxy. Epoxy has a shelf life, just like lettuce. Fresh epoxy cures better and harder than old epoxy, so this is right out of a new package. Once I've got it mixed, I smear epoxy on the bolster with the pins in it. Then I put the bolster on. Then I put more on the face of the second bolster and carefully press it onto the pins. I don't want to go all crazy with the epoxy, just enough for a good bond. Now I push it all together. Using a Warrington hammer, also known as a cross-peen hammer, I'll peen the ends on the pins. I want to make sure that I get a little bit of pin protruding from both sides of the bolster. If I do all the peening on one side and knock the other pin face into the bolster, there won't be enough material left on the other side to flare out, and so only one side will get properly flared. So I peen a little on this side, flip it over, make sure the pins are protruding there too, and then I peen them. Flip, peen, flip, peen. I just keep flipping back and forth until I got them all flush with the bolster. I'm also making sure that the two bolsters are squeezed totally flush to the blade. Once I'm happy with the peening, I'll pop a clamp on there. Now don't clamp the snot out of it. If you squeeze all the glue out, you've got nothing left to stick. If the bolster moves much when I clamp it, that means I'll need to peen just a little more to close everything up. Next, I'll take some solvent and clean all the squeeze out on the blade side. If you don't, you'll scratch up your blade trying to remove it later. I'm using lacquer thinner because I'm hoping to grow an excellent crop of cancer in my brain. You may use something smarter. Don't go nuts with it though. You don't want the solvent getting in the glue joint and leaking all the glue out of the bolster. Just enough to remove the squeeze out, then clean it up and you're done. Now set it aside and let the epoxy cure according to the manufacturer's directions. Once the bolster's glued up, I'll clean out any squeeze out that I might have left on the inside of the bolster. Then I'll choose the prettiest part of my handle scales, cut them on the bandsaw, and then trim and square them on my disc grinder so they'll cover the blade completely. Once I've got them all squared up, I'll drill the pinholes with a 3/16 inch bit. You want to use the holes in the blade as a guide. Make dead sure that the face of the handle scale and the bolster are pushed up completely flush. If they aren't, you'll drill the holes in the wrong place, which will result in a gap between the bolster and the scale. Tinker however much it takes to get this right. Then drill both the pinholes and the 1/4 inch thong tube hole. Once you've drilled one scale, put the second scale on using the same procedure, then drill through from the other side. I like to keep both scales on. This way you know absolutely that that drill bit is going to go straight through those holes, and therefore the Corby pins will be able to go through too. Again, great care has to be taken with positioning and clamping. You can't neglect getting the face of the bolster flush up with the face of the scales. Let's talk about the handle pins. I'm using what are known as Corby fittings. The basic idea is that you have a threaded sleeve or female part on one side and a male part that threads into it, which is going to come through from the other side. You snug them up with screwdrivers and then you grind these big fat long heads off. That leaves a nice, clean, attractive, and extremely durable pin holding the scales on. Let's see how this works in practice. After drilling the primary holes with the Corby pin, you'll use a step drill to countersink the hole for the Corby fitting. What's a step drill? You can check out my recent video about how to make a step drill to find more information on that, but basically it's just a drill that cuts two concentric diameters of hole at the same time. And that's exactly what you need in order to seat the flange at the top of the Corby fitting. In this case, it drills a 1/4 inch hole for the large diameter and a 3/16 for the smaller diameter. The inner sleeve or post on the Corby fitting is about 330 thousandths inches long. So I'll need to drill down just enough so that the shaft of the Corby fitting will almost, but not quite, pass from one side to the other. This way, when I tighten the fitting, it will exert a small amount of compressive force on the wood, snugging it up to the tang. Don't undershoot too much though, or you can bow or tear the scales when you snug up the fittings because you'll be compressing too much wood. Now you're ready to glue the scales. Again, get everything laid out and ready to go. You don't want to be tearing your shop apart looking for one more clamp while the epoxy is setting on you. As with the bolsters, I'll degrease all the surfaces and maybe give them a final scuff with a heavy grit sandpaper. The rougher the surface, the more surface area there is for the epoxy to cling to. Incidentally, when you're using an oily wood like cocobolo, ebony, or rosewood, you actually want to use a solvent on the inner face of the wood too. This will help the epoxy to adhere better to the wood by removing surface oils. Now I'll slather epoxy all over everything and assemble. Unlike with the bolsters, I don't care if I put a ton of the stuff on and I get crazy amounts of squeeze out. I just want glue everywhere. The Corby pins are driven into the holes and then screwed tight. Here's how it looks after they've been screwed together. The thong tube is also epoxied and driven into its hole. Then I slap on a bunch of clamps. Make sure you clamp all the way around the edges and get everything sealed up nice and tight. Again, no gaps, please. Also, don't over tighten those glue joints. If you squeeze all the glue out, then you might as well not use it in the first place. This epoxy fully cures in 24 hours. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel and check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you can find more of my work. You'll also find plenty more videos there that you can't find on YouTube with very, very detailed information about all aspects of Japanese blade making. Also, like me on Facebook at Walter Sorrells Blades.